I grew up in a small town and moved back to one in my early 30s, which I think is a specific kind of homecoming that requires no explanation to anyone who's done it. The town I settled in had about 2,000 people, a grain elevator visible from most of the county roads leading into it, a diner that served breakfast all day, and the kind of deep quiet at night that you either love immediately or can't tolerate at all. I loved it. I bought a small house on the north end of Grover Street, a dead-end road with 6 properties backing up against a stretch of scrub and old fence line. My nearest neighbors were a retired couple to the left and a young family to the right. We waved, we talked across fences. I left a bag of tomatoes on the retired couple's porch when my garden ran ahead of me. It was that kind of street. In October of my second year there, a man came to my door on a Tuesday afternoon. He was middle-aged, neatly dressed, dark slacks, a button-down shirt, a canvas bag over one shoulder. He introduced himself as a regional census supplement worker, doing a follow-up survey for a county demographic study. He had a clipboard with a form on it. He seemed entirely unremarkable. He asked standard-seeming questions. How long had I lived here? How many people in the household? Did I work locally or commute? Basic things. I answered without much thought. He thanked me, made notes on his clipboard, and moved on to the next house. I watched him cross the yard toward my neighbors, the Callaways, where he knocked and went through what appeared to be the same routine. I forgot about it within the hour. 2 weeks later, I was at the diner having coffee with a woman named Helen, who'd lived in the town her entire life and knew everything worth knowing about it. I mentioned the census man in passing, something about how thorough county records had become. Helen put her mug down and looked at me with an expression I didn't immediately read. She said there was no county demographic study. She said she'd been on the county planning board for 9 years, and she'd heard nothing about a census supplement. She said she'd asked around after a few neighbors had mentioned the same man, and nobody had been able to verify his affiliation with anything official. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the questions he'd asked. Routine questions, each one individually, but together they formed a fairly complete picture. Who lives in each house, whether anyone else was present, work schedule, whether the occupant was alone. I called the county administrative office that afternoon. They confirmed what Helen had told me. No such survey was authorized or underway. They took my description of the man and his methods and said they'd look into it. Over the following few days, I spoke to 4 other households on Grover Street and 2 on the street behind mine. Every one of them had been visited. Every one of them had answered. I started thinking about what someone could do with that information. Not immediately, not dramatically, just turning it over quietly. Who lives alone? Who works days? Which house has a family? Which has one person? Which has a retired couple who go to bed by 9? The man was never publicly identified, as far as I know. Whether he was caught or simply stopped, I was never told. What the county office did recommend, though, was that we all document what we'd shared and take practical precautions, which we did. What changed for me wasn't dramatic. I just became someone who asks for identification before answering a single question at my door. I look up organizations before I speak to their representatives. I notice now when a stranger's questions are individually innocent, but collectively a portrait. Small towns are trusting places. That's the genuine, true thing about them. But trust, extended to the wrong person, is just information handed over willingly. The census man knew that. He counted on it. Dunmore Lane,
was a county road about 3 miles outside of a town called Reedy Falls. Population just under 1,400. The kind of place where the high school gym doubles as the emergency shelter, and everybody knows which families have been there for generations and which ones are newer. I was newer, 6 months in, still learning the geography. I ran in the mornings. It was a habit I'd brought with me from the city and hadn't been able to shake, and the county roads around Reedy Falls were good for it. Flat, low traffic, the kind of air that doesn't exist inside city limits. I had 3 routes. Dunmore Lane was part of my longest one, a 5-mile loop that took me out past the old Hendricks farm and back in through the edge of town. In November, sunrise came late. By the time I was out at 6:15, the sky was still a deep gray blue, the road barely visible beyond my headlamp. I liked it. The world felt like it was only just beginning. The farmhouse at the far end of Dunmore Lane had been empty as long as anyone I'd asked could remember. A 2-story white clapboard set back from the road by a long gravel drive, surrounded by overgrown fields. No for sale sign, no visible upkeep. The kind of property that exists in a legal limbo of distant ownership and accumulated property tax. I ran past it every other morning for 3 months without incident. Then, one morning in late November, I noticed a light in the upper window. Not a bright light, dim, yellowish, the kind that might come from a battery lamp or a candle. It was in the right side upper window, barely visible through the dirty glass. I slowed to a walk as I passed and looked up at it. It didn't flicker, didn't move. I picked my pace back up and completed my route. I wasn't alarmed exactly. Old houses have all sorts of explanations for odd lights. Reflections, wildlife that's gotten inside, wiring that's not entirely dead. I filed it under interesting and moved on. I noticed it again 2 mornings later. Same window, same dim, still glow. This time I stopped entirely and stood at the roadside looking up at it for nearly a minute. The house gave nothing else away. No sound, no movement, no vehicle in the drive. I mentioned it to Ray, who'd lived in Reedy Falls his whole life and had a practical outlook on most things. He knew the house, the Hendricks property, he called it, and said it had been unoccupied since he was in his 20s. He didn't know who technically owned it anymore. When I described the light, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd drive past it on his way to the feed store and take a look. He called me that evening. He said the window was dark when he passed. He'd gotten out and walked the drive part way and hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. Over the following 3 weeks, I tracked the light more carefully. It appeared on 9 of my morning runs. Always the same window, always between 6:15 and 6:40, which was the window of my passing, always gone by the time anyone else thought to look. The detail that finally made me bring it to the county sheriff's non-emergency line was not the light itself, but something I noticed on a morning when I stopped and looked more carefully at the gravel drive. The frost on the gravel was disturbed, not heavily, not tire tracks, nothing that obvious, but the surface was inconsistently frosted, the way gravel looks when it's been walked on recently, and the disturbed pieces have had just enough time to partially refrost. Someone was walking that drive, regularly in the pre-dawn hours. The deputy who came out did a thorough walk of the property. The house was accessible through a back window that lost its latch, and inside they found signs of recent occupation in one of the upper rooms, the right side front room directly above the window where I had seen the light. Nothing that indicated long-term residence, but enough to establish that someone was using the space. Whether they were sheltering there or using it for some other purpose, I was never clearly told. The deputy was thorough but careful about what he shared. What stayed with me was the consistency of the timing. Whoever was in that room had either noticed my schedule or happened to keep the light on only during the window of my passing. I've never fully settled on which of those is less unsettling. I still run in the mornings. I changed my route.
I'll tell you about Sutter, which is what I'll call the town, and I'll tell you about Margaret, which is what I'll call the woman who lived across the road from me for the 3 years I spent there. Sutter was the kind of town that had one of everything. One hardware store, one post office counter inside the general store, one church that most of the town attended whether or not they considered themselves religious, and one road in and out. It sat in a low valley between two ridge lines, and in winter the fog settled into it and didn't leave for days. I'd moved there for a job with a regional forestry office. I planned to stay 2 years. I stayed 3, and the reason I finally left is what I want to tell you about. Margaret had lived in the house across from me for decades. She was in her 70s, small, sharp-eyed, deliberate in the way people get when they've lived alone a long time. She kept a tidy yard and a vegetable garden that ran the full length of her south fence, and she waved at me every morning from her porch when I left for work. She was not a warm woman exactly, but she was consistent, and in Sutter, consistency meant something. In the second winter I was there, Margaret's waves stopped. Not immediately, not all at once. They just became less frequent, and then occasional. And then one morning I realized I hadn't seen her on that porch in 11 days. I told myself she was unwell. I told myself the cold had driven her inside. I left a note in her mailbox asking if she needed anything. She didn't respond. I asked at the general store. Most of them knew Margaret. Most of them had the same answer. They hadn't seen her either, but Margaret sometimes kept to herself in the deep of winter. It wasn't unusual. I let myself be reassured by that. Then I began noticing something about her house at night. Margaret had a particular habit with her lights. I'd observed it over 2 years without consciously cataloging it. Her kitchen light on until about 9, the sitting room until 10, then the upstairs bedroom until she turned in. It was as regular as a clock. Small-town nights are quiet enough that you notice the lights across the road without meaning to. The lights in Margaret's house were no longer following that pattern. They were on at the wrong times. The kitchen light burning at 2 in the morning, the sitting room dark for 3 consecutive evenings, and then blazing all night. The bedroom light never coming on at all. The pattern wasn't absent, it was inverted, randomized, as if someone was present in the house but didn't know the house's rhythms. I brought it up with my closest neighbor in Sutter, a man named Carl, who'd lived 2 doors down for 30 years and had the quiet authority of someone who'd watched a lot come and go. I described the lights. I described not seeing Margaret. Carl's expression shifted in a way that made me take it seriously. He suggested we check on her together. We walked across the road on a Saturday morning and knocked. Knocked again. Carl called her name. Margaret answered the door after the 3rd knock. She was fine, physically fine, but her demeanor was different than I'd ever seen it. She spoke briefly, kept the door at a narrow angle, said she had been unwell and was recovering. She thanked us and closed the door before we could say much else. Carl and I stood on her porch for a moment. He looked at the door, then at me, and said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "That woman has lived alone for 30 years, and she doesn't close the door on people." We brought it to the county welfare line. a resource for checking on elderly residents. A social worker came out within 2 days, and what unfolded from that visit was handled carefully and took some time to fully understand. Margaret was not alone in her house. A distant relation, a man she'd lost contact with years ago, had arrived at her door in late November, and she had, out of a complicated mix of obligation and uncertainty, allowed him to stay. His presence had become something more than a visit. He had made himself difficult to remove, and she had not felt free to ask for help. The details were handled with appropriate discretion. Margaret was supported through a process that resulted in the man leaving. She was connected with ongoing services. By spring, she was back on the porch. The waves came back, steadier than before. She and I spoke more after that than we ever had in 2 years of being neighbors. She told me once, almost in passing, that she'd been grateful someone had noticed the lights, that she hadn't known how to signal anything directly, but that something in her kept the patterns wrong on purpose. I've thought about that often, about how people who need help sometimes can't ask for it plainly, about the signals that exist in the ordinary rhythms of a life and what it means when those rhythms change. I left Sutter the following autumn. Margaret was well. Her lights followed their pattern. Some things are worth watching for, even, especially, when they seem too small to mention.